Hello everybody. I'm going to try and talk a bit about the background for the soul retrieval story that I explained about in my last two videos, because I just plumped you right in the middle of that without really sharing anything of my past or the reasons why I felt I needed to go there. And I have been writing about this, the theme of this video, and trying to take notes and to organize my thoughts, etc. And it'll probably have helped. But I can't read something to you from like a piece of paper at this moment. That doesn't feel right to be doing it that way. I just have to, just present it from me to you in one straight line. So the thing is, if I go back, let's just go back into the past a bit. My parents, both my parents, I am Dutch, by the way. I am a citizen of the Netherlands, and I've always had a Dutch nationality. However, I've lived in foreign countries, a couple of them, for quite a number of years, especially as a kid. And my parents were both very fragile people, really. They had been, their lives had been heavily impacted by the Second World War. And in the case of my dad, it hadn't been, he had been on a, I don't know what you call that, like a refugee child during at least a year, but I don't know exactly how long. He's been away from his family when he was like about 8-9 years old or something. He'd been transported to the countryside along with a number of other Jewish kids, and there's been bad things happening to them. He's been very vulnerable, of course, as we all are at that age. However, I don't know any details because my parents, like I said, my parents divorced, so I couldn't ask him about it. I have asked him since on one occasion, and he hasn't really gone into it in much detail. I can't really speak to him anymore. He's still alive, by the way, but I just don't see us talking that easily. It's part of the problem, part of the situation. My mother, on the other hand, who I really grew up with after the divorce as well, she was, I should say, in a concentration camp in Indonesia, which was at that time a Dutch colony. My grandfather used to be a teacher there before the war. So they were interned in two separate camps, the men and the women, and well, you can find information about that. What mainly one of the effects on my mother directly was that she suffered hunger for 4 years, going from 8 years old more or less to 11. She was in one or two of those camps with her mother. So that was what you read in research that's been done on this kind of situation, is you get people, the next generations, the children of people who've been in the concentration camps, also the Indonesian camps where there weren't gas chambers, and well, it depends a bit where you were, but my parents, my mother wasn't really treated all that badly, other than not getting enough to eat. They were more or less left to their own devices. But what you get in the next generation is that you grow up with parents who have unresolved problems, and you don't know most of the time how bad that is. You only know that whatever it is that's on your mind, or that you have going on growing up as a kid or as an adolescent, it can never be as bad as what they've been through. So that's how I grew up. My mother fell ill once I was, I suppose, in the same period that my parents really divorced. Before that, she was more or less normal, fairly okay, I think. However, after divorcing and all sorts of details that I'll go into in a bit, she got more and more problems with her belly organs. All of it was a mess, and she was in pain often. And so I learned to just not ask anything, not to want stuff, not to go be in her face, or that was just one small aspect. In everyday life, just in general, I couldn't really depend on my mother like you are supposed to be able to depend on parents when you're a kid, when you're 12. You don't know anything, and they're supposed to be there to help you. And well, that's just one element. Going back to all that war history, war experiences that I have not personally gone through. So there's a great discrepancy there between the way I felt in my own life, the things I went through in my own life I was always reminded that none of it was really bad enough to matter. So that's, I'm a Leo. I don't really take well to that kind of treatment. I want attention. That's one reason why I'm here on YouTube now. I laugh a bit, I giggle because, yeah, well, at this point, it's just okay to be giggly about it. However, when, if I go back in time a bit more, when I was like a toddler, 3-4 years old, my parents started falling out and having loud. My father had loud arguments and discussions and slamming of doors and that, and my mother withdrew in silence and resentment. And the more she withdrew, of course, the more he got upset and annoyed with her and tried to, provoke her and tease her and I don't know what. I suppose he had originally not such terrible bad intention, but it was, well, they were both fragile, as I said. They were both, I don't mind saying they were both a bit nuts. And they had lived fairly isolated lives. They had siblings, they had parents, but they tried to get away from them as much as possible. One consequence of that was that we moved house all the time. My father worked for, I think it's called the European Broadcasting Union, something like that. It's a part of UNESCO. He had a job for, I think it was 2 years, and then we lived in Geneva, in Switzerland. And that's what my earliest memories are from there. And one half of the memories is the glorious lake and the view of the lake and the mountains and sunshine and beautiful weather and all that. And the other half, there's a truck passing by in the street, people, there's nothing to worry about. The other half of my memories is my mother being desperate and angry, very angry. My mother could be a very angry, very frightening woman in silence, and that's just crippled me. At one time, I was like 4 years old. I went to Lissel School in that just around the corner. At one time, I just went for a walk from school. Somebody should have been there to pick me up or something. They didn't catch me in time, and I just wandered off. Kids tend to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Although I remember the feeling at the time. I was just exploring. I was just walking. I didn't care. I just... My mother, my dad found me, put me in my room. Your mother will be here in a bit. And she beat the living daylights out of me. She'd never really... well, I knew her to be suppressed and angry, and I was frightened of her. But I didn't really have any memories at that point. I just remember the beating and the shouting and screaming. And I was terrified. I was So there's a basis right there of fear that has been in my life always. I'm telling you all this so you get like an alternative explanation for the soul retrieval story, if that makes any sense to you. You can choose, right? You choose whichever makes most sense to you. I think in a way you could say from this that I repressed everything emotionally that I couldn't manage or that I couldn't deal with. I was inside a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. I was still the toddler I was then. And I did have no tools, I had no experience, I had no understanding of life, of myself. I did have no perception of myself, which is like, you're a kid, right? You're 3 years old, you have no real perception of yourself. It's just one life experience. And well, that's where I got stuck. It's one of the phases where I got stuck. And I suppose you might say that the whole soul retrieval adventure, the way I described it, the way I sort of, more or less the way actually I experienced it, was just digging up the parts of me that are capable of processing and are capable of feeling and responding and, you know, taking time to understand things, to understand my own position and other people's position from there. That's what's happening to me now. I can talk to people, I can talk to myself, and from there I can talk to people, because I kind of figured out now what it's supposed to feel like and how it works and all that. Anyway, after the incident of the runaway child, it was sort of more or less, I suppose, to the extent that you can say that, it was okay, normal household going on. We moved again. We moved from that glorious scenery in the Alps to the northeast of the Netherlands. There is no place drearier and grayer than East Groningen. It's a flat line, one horizon. There's one or two trees, and for the rest it's just potato fields and beetroot fields and that kind of stuff. And of course, yeah, winter and dismal. My mother was miserable. However, she had lived there when, with her relatives, with her family, when they came out of the concentration camps back to Holland. So maybe, I just realized a couple of years ago, my dad actually wanted to move to Groningen for her, to try to make her happy in some way, because she was happy when she was an adolescent in that part of the country, and she had friends and she had fun, and she talked about that sometimes, and that was a really nice period of her life. I don't know how long she lived there at that time. It may have been 3 or 4 years, I don't know, but she was okay. And the war was behind her. Everything was sort of, everybody was having enough food again. It was, she went to school and progress was being made. So as far as she was concerned, it was a fairly happy period. So we lived there, and it was hell. It was just isolation. We were stuck in that house, the 3 of us. I don't know what my father did work-wise. He was away some of the time. I think he was utterly miserable himself. I have his genes, so I can sort of feel how I have a lot of information in my, I don't know what you could call that, in my emotional memory, I suppose, about the way people used to feel. And I suspect I'm not the only one who's like that. It's always all there, and it's always messing with us, whether we like it or not. So we react to stuff, we respond to stuff. Stuff is moving and changing and going on. Anyway, after a while, the situation between my parents got rather bad, and she was crying and shouting, and he was shouting and screaming, and I think he was also hitting her. I'm not quite sure about that, because by then I was 5. And my father had my mother committed to an insane asylum for a period. I have no idea how long exactly. Probably he just left her there and said, you have to take care of her because she's nuts and she's dangerous. I don't think she was all that dangerous. She was just overwrought, and she couldn't sleep, and he was keeping her up all night, and help, horrible. And they didn't know what to do with me. They put me with friends, and by that time I was 6 years old, and I stayed with those friends, a different part of the country, middle of the country, nice old homes, beautiful town, harmonious, lots of beautiful trees and stuff. They put me there, and they left me there for about a year or so. After a few months, my mother discovered that she could actually not, she wasn't really a prisoner in that insane institution. She, I don't know, you call it mentally, whatever you call those things. I don't have time to look it up at the moment, and I'm also a bit tired, so let's just get on with it, okay? She found out she wasn't really a prisoner. She wasn't really kept there against her will. She could walk out. And she did, and she had met up with a couple of musicians who had played at the institution, at the place where she stayed, and they took her in, and they helped her to get on her feet for a bit. And so my mother was a very practical person, and she organized, once she was away from the medication that they had given her, which made her drugged and drowsy, and antidepressants, there you go. She found that she could think for herself fairly well, and so she got herself a bit of what do you call that? It's like a state support, some kind of an allowance so that she could live. She found herself a place to stay, at first with a couple of other friends, and then afterwards she managed to find herself a tiny little home. And after a couple of rather nasty arguments with her own father and her younger brother, she managed to discover where I was, because for like 6, 7, 8 months, I know some period at least as long as that, she had no idea where I was, her daughter, her only child of 6 years old. She had no idea where I was. She was worried out of her mind. That period, now that I'm telling you about this, I can see this has been so bad for her, because she'd already been through enough. And to have to worry where your girl is, I don't know. She loved me. She was, after that, she was always, she was very overprotective. She didn't want to let go of me. She was possessive and all that. But it's understandable, isn't it? At least, well, I think so. Anyway, I was the other person in the story. At some point, and I guess I stayed with those friends of my dad's basically for about a year. In 1974, on the 14th of February, and in my opinion it's a Tuesday, but it's easy to check, isn't it? At noon, midday, normally always somebody came to pick me up, have a sandwich at home, and bring me back to school on their bike or something, or to accompany me while I rode a small bike and they were on their own. This one single day, and my mother had no knowledge of this, I was supposed to walk out the street and down another one, or just around the corner of the school, and have lunch with a friend. However, when I stepped out of the school gate, there was a green Deux Chevaux Citroen right in front of me, and a bearded guy that I'd never seen in my life. And he said, "Are you Eline?" And I said, "Yes." And he opened the back door of the car, and there was my mother. And before I could say rocks and blocks, as Tolkien says, he shoved me right into the car, slammed the door and got back in himself and drove off. What we've always referred to jokingly as the kidnapping. All this has sort of been my knowledge about the time, and it's just information, right? It's just facts. Last winter, because of all the emotional processing that I've been going through and all the thinking and the crying and, wrestling with myself in order to sort of find out who I really am, I came back to these memories, and all of a sudden I felt that I was back there, not at the school, but at the house where those people, those friends of my dad's, lived at that time. I had my own room, and I was sitting, last December, I was sitting by that child that I was on the side of the bed in that dark room, and it was just very quiet. All around me, everybody was asleep, I suppose. I was asleep. No, I wasn't asleep. I had just gone to bed, so I wasn't really asleep. But I was surrounded by an atmosphere of peace and quiet and dedication, because they were classical musicians. They were always about music, and they even tried to teach me the piano. And last December, I just fell apart again. I just broke, I burst into tears, and luckily my husband was with me, and we've been through a lot together, so he knows that at that kind of time, he just has to hold me, and that's all. And I bawl my eyes out, and it lasts like 10-15 minutes, and then I find a way to deal with it, or I find some kind of perspective again after that. At that time, within the tears and within the desperation, there's no perspective, because for the first time, I could actually get to the emotion of that moment, and it was so badly conflicted. I was in a mess at that time, but because I had no help and nobody really talked to me, and that was normal in those days, because you're supposed to grow up normal, safe, repetitive, boring preferably, because then you can sort of develop from there. My life hadn't been repetitive and boring and predictable in any way, and there had been there had been some violence anyway, and there had been a lot of fear. And suddenly I was in an atmosphere where there was no fear, there was no need to be afraid. And that single sensation, it just brought the whole thing home to me. How miserable I had been as a toddler, as a kid. I was like 4, 5 years old, and all I could see was them two banging on about stuff that I didn't understand, of course, and stuff going on behind closed doors, power struggles, him, trying to get her to do stuff, I don't know. And I was very, very worried and afraid, and I had no tools, nothing whatsoever how to react, how to respond. I couldn't be a part of any of it. They were my parents. They were part of me, both of them. They're still part of me. So they're important to you, aren't they, your parents? So after that, I started drawing. I've always drawn. I told you, I'm a big drawer and creative person. And I made a couple of drawings because I felt it was really important for me to draw the way I felt in that sensation of being in a new place where everything is fine, and you're just confronted with how much baggage you got, and you just don't know, you feel like you're falling apart. I have in my Rose Oracle cards, remember these? Will look a lot better on this screen than on the other one. I have a card, here it is. Let's see if I can show that to you. whether it will focus nicely. I think so. That's what I drew, except this is a smaller and slightly neater version. There's a pink bird falling onto a floor of tiles, and it has a drop of blood coming out of its chest. There's a large grey wave going on over the top of everything, and there's an orchid flower. The orchid flower was put in onto this card only. It's not on the original drawing, because it's in the oracle that I made. You want to have some sort of a resolution for this, and the orchid is a type of flower that grows in this country where I live now, in the Netherlands, in the countryside, and it's a very pretty flower that grows and grows, and they make long stalks, go on forever, and they bloom like one flower a day, or maybe 2 or 3, for a couple of days, and then the next bud opens and the other one turns to seed, and so on and so on, and that goes on for months. I think 6 weeks, 2 months possibly. So they're really long breath flowering plants. They just keep at it forever, and they have this little cup-like container. I don't know if you can see that. If I can't put it too close to the screen. There's a white lip, and behind that there's a red spot. And the red spot is like a little basin with some kind of red stuff in it, and that attracts bees and insects. So to me, orchids are always all about finding a symmetry, finding, not asymmetry, symmetry, finding your center, and sort of, showing your best traits, showing your best self, etc. And I suppose that had to do, I just put it in the card because it felt right, and it felt hopeful, and it felt more like there's always a connection, as long as I manage to stay connected to those kinds of emotions. Because in the old days, before the soul retrieval events occurred, I had no way of keeping emotional contact with any part of myself that had been in these experiences. It was just, everything was lost to me, and all I had was a few facts. That's what happened, 14th of February, blah blah blah, and no depth and no me in the story. But it was, so yeah, it was fairly traumatic. And when I got into that famous car, that Citroen car, and my mother was there, the only thing I thought at that moment, oh no, it's her again. Here I am on YouTube confessing. Today is the 27th of August 2018, and I have said it out loud in the world. I didn't want to see my mother again at that moment, because she was pain. She was always in pain, either mentally, emotionally, or physically, or all three of those. And I didn't know how to deal with it, because I'm also partly my father's daughter. And I just couldn't stand the antagonism. I couldn't stand there's always the other guy's perspective, isn't there? And I don't know. I did later what she wanted. We moved house. Again, I lived with her after that episode. She got the custody arranged to have me in her house. After a while, there were lawsuits and all sorts of horrible, most of it was just dramatic, and I didn't get any of it, and I was just mostly sent to school, or being looked after. And after a while, I settled down again with her, and my father wasn't there anymore, so she was relieved. He wasn't in our lives anymore, and she was okay with that. I wasn't. I missed my dad, but I had no say in the matter. So we moved house again, and again and again. And there were a couple of times where I had friends in school and I didn't really like to go again, but it was just a fact of life. We moved house every year, every 2 years, more or less. So by the time I was 12, I think I'd moved another 4 or 5 times. And we went because my mother's health was rather failing a bit, and she was just, she wanted to try something else. She wanted to move out of the Netherlands, so to the south, to a better climate. And the idea was that we could get a move if we took some of our stuff, not so much furniture, but just a couple of bags of clothes and stuff like that, and a couple of necessities. And then my grandfather, her father, that she'd been arguing with on and off all the time, he went to Spain for his holidays once a year, and he tended to stay there for 6 weeks or something with a caravan, and we went with him. And instead of going to Benidorm, where he used to stay in his favorite place, we went there. We went to Benidorm, and then after a few days, we moved farther south, and we stayed in Andalusia, in Marbella, actually, close to Malaga, almost Gibraltar, almost. And I went. My granddad left after a couple of weeks. He left again, and he moved back north to back home. And I tried to adapt to life in a completely different country again. And this has happened several more times in my adolescence. So it's no wonder that I had no real relationships and no real possibilities of making and keeping contact with people, because everybody was just gone always. After a couple of years, it was just there was just no more to be exchanged, and nobody. Of course, once you're 16 or 17 years old, you encounter all the time that nobody really understands where you're coming from. You have got this particular kind of life, and they have a completely different kind of life. So it's impossible to. You can get along, but you cannot really feel similarities or connection that easily anymore. And then on top of that, there were of course all the other psychological issues and pain and trauma and unresolved stuff. So by the time I was 18 or 19, I went, when I was 18, I went to study. I'm not going into all the years and the change in details. It's just how I grew up was really, I was always afraid, and I learned things only intellectually. So I developed and I grew and I changed only intellectually. So by the time I was 18, I went to university. I always had a knack for languages, but then again I had to, because I had been immersed in different kinds of languages from the time I was 4. So I learned to speak all kinds of lingos. That was fine. And I went to Amsterdam to live with my grandfather, actually, the same granddad. And I stayed with him for 3 years, because there was a real house shortage in housing for students. And I thought, well, my granddad's alone anyway, so why not? He had a big enough apartment. I could stay there easily. And that's where I loved studying. I loved knowledge, and in a big, huge library with so much stuff I'd never heard of. Fantastic. But of course, nothing really changed for me emotionally until I actually met my husband. And then I found out that there's actually other people in the world. So we have been having a very interesting life together, because actually both of us at that time, for the first time in our lives, we found somebody who'd been through similar pain and stress and loneliness. So the other person could actually understand where you were coming from, much better than either of us ever thought would be possible. So that's been a blessing for both of us, and we have both of us valued our connection so much that we have stuck together like two limpets on a same oyster shell, because there was no way anything was going to come between us. That, for me, was never an option. I have sometimes shouted at him, sometimes I've been angry or disappointed or what have you, but after 10 minutes or so, I forget all about it, because it's just, I know him and he knows me. So that's been just perfect for both of us, because this way we always have somebody who has our back. My back, he has my back, I have his. And best interest, and sometimes you need common sense, lots and lots of common sense to, make your headway from all the weird shit that's been going on. And sometimes you need a bigger picture, another perspective, a different perspective, or some form of healing to help you along the way. And there's been a very large number of things that have helped me, and that's also one of the things I want to go into on my channel. And I suppose all this has become rather more personal and rather more intense than I expected. However, I just wanted to get this couple of nasty nutshells of, dramatic experiences out there and then out of the way. So it's, it's in the past. You know about this now, and it's most of it is very long ago, like almost half a century ago. So we have now come to this glorious situation where I am actually grown up enough. A lot of what I've been doing is just simply growing up, I suppose, where you can untangle the emotions and the pressures that have been put onto me to behave in a certain way, or to not behave in a particular way, or to say certain things and not certain other things, and all that, coming from the past. And I have used very many tools to help me in this process, but I do not really need any tools anymore at the moment. It's just that they're very pretty. See? These two, for example, very different. Malachite, rose quartz, eggs. My 2 eggs. Fantastic. Really beautiful. This one is actually fairly recent find. I think I've got it 2 years now. It's a really great stone for connecting with my body as well. And that's always important, isn't it? When you have, when there's old suffering going on, the body suffers, and the body throws stuff in your face, makes migraines, makes muscle pains, makes back pains, makes all sorts of stuff like that, because it's trying to tell you something. This is a friend of my body, and I appreciate it very much. So it was very funny in the shop, because when I bought it there was 2 of these, and this is the one that had to come with me. The other one is for somebody else. I could tell there was a difference in vibration, whatever you call it. We'll go into all that scientific terminology and what words to use and why you should not use certain words. I don't care, as long as you use the words, speak about it, because it's all way too interesting. So there you are, in a nutshell. I want to show you my cards, because, as I said, after the actual soul retrieval healing experience that I went through, I had all this emotional life coming back to me, if you remember, and I went to town, to Eindhoven, which is Philips town, really, and I bought a deck. This one, Mary Packard Visconti Sforza. They were really cheap, 15 euros, and here's the judgment card again. Really beautiful colours, a bit big for my hands, see? So they're a rather pain to shuffle. But I connected with this deck like nothing else. So they still feel very warm and very comforting and very friendly. Even though in the spread that I had for today, for this particular YouTube session that we're in now, I pulled cards and I got the Nine of Wands and the Seven of Cups, the Hermit and the Two of Wands. Those were the cards. So you see pips all over. And even though they're pretty and they're antique and nice and comfy and old school and all that, what I always tend to do is I dig out my Marielle to have a bit of a view of what the cards look like in her interpretation. And here's the Nine of Wands, which I take to be pride in achievement at this time for me. Seven of Cups, the past, and all the misplaced, between brackets, longings and hopes and ideals and fondness and subservience, submission, this kind of stuff. Tricky. Hermit, yes, it's a hermit with a lot of ocean waves, and he's got like this wave coming out of his face. Hermit's a hermit, so it's fine. I don't really connect much with this card, connect as much with the Visconti Sforza card, really. And this is the Two of Wands. New adventure, a new pathway. It reminds me terribly of the movie of The Hobbit. I think it's part 2, where they go into Mirkwood, so you get spiders after that. Yuck, no, thank you. But I love the trees, and there's people in the bark of the trees. You can't see that, but you have to get yourself your own Marielle deck. Please do, if you want to. It's such a great deck. There's people and figures and I think animals as well in there, and it's very mysterious and old wood, and it's beautiful. So it has to do with adventure. It has to do with being ready for a new phase, really, for me. This card has everything to do with being ready for I'm going there no matter what, and some of you are coming with me, and because you like me or you react to me or you respond to me with something that I'm putting out there, it's not even so much up to me anymore, is it? Once I put it out there, as long as I just keep putting big content lumps out there, then these are my children. You just go and live, and whatever happens is fine, really. And so far I've had a couple of comments. Beautiful. I haven't had that many likes yet, which of course I mind, but then again, it's not up to me. What's up to me is giving you as much content as I possibly can, just putting it all out there. And this was a rather large, big, heavy session, and I thought I should finish up right now by showing you these two. They're still Visconti Sforza, the Sun and the Wheel of Fortune. My mother's spirit, shade, that still, to the extent that she's still on this planet and still around somehow, keeps nudging me towards this one. One day I'll know what she means by it, but she keeps pushing me towards this card. This is her card, Wheel of Fortune. you know. And this one actually got out of Simon Hermit Cave's Tarothon video explanation that he gave about how to pick your life card, or I don't know what exactly he called it, I don't remember. You had to go through a deck of cards one by one and select a few that you resonated with, and then pick up the cards that you resonated with and go through them again and again, as long as was necessary, and it takes an hour or so. I used the Marielle for this. And the last bit was the most difficult. It took me an age to decide between, I think it was the Knight of Wands and the Sun. And in the end, it turned out that this is my card. So whether I really have a lot of self, it used to be my card when I was 4 years old. It was my card when I was 18 years old, and it's still my card to this day. Whether it's this one or the Marielle one or this one, a smaller Marseille printout thin cardboard and wallpaper glue. Again, it is the sun that gives me a sense of, you know what, it'll be okay. Let's go have a coffee. For cripe's sake, let's go have a drink. Let's go have a bit of a day to ourselves. Let's talk about something else. Let's plan a holiday. Let's enjoy ourselves. And on that rather more cheerful note, I hope, I'm going to leave you again, and we will go into more cheerful territory from here on out. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye.